I think that when we're looking at the matter of how things are shaped or how movements work, right, I would argue that the LGBTQ movement is actually dependent on many predecessors, one of which was essentially sort of an anarchist/libertarian view of how the state should treat people. And I believe that comes out of Victoria Woodhull.
The freedom to love who you want to love without government interference may seem like a relatively new thing, but the push for this ideal actually goes as far back as the 19th century with the free love movement.
So the free love movement was essentially a middle-class movement from 19th century America. It came out of, to varying degrees, utopian communities, such as the Robert Owen community. And it essentially said that people should be free to make their own decisions about their private and personal lives around romance, around sexuality. It was condemned by many ministers, by priests, by the more conservative social purity movements, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They were not 1960s hippies. They did not say everybody should be sleeping around. They were not saying people should be totally free with their sexuality. They were simply saying that the state had no right to dictate how people led their personal lives around romance and sexuality.
One of the leaders of this movement was Victoria Woodhull.
So Victoria Woodhull was the first woman to run for president in this country, which a lot of people have forgotten because she has not been included in history textbooks. But she was really a leader in this nation as a suffrage leader, as a woman who started a newspaper, as a woman who had a firm on Wall Street.
And I think the most important thing about her for us today, right, is that she was actually what we would call a sex radical. She was a self-described free lover, which meant that although she was married 3 times and probably monogamous in all those marriages, she believed that the state should have nothing to say about how she chose lovers, when she chose them, or how long she stayed with them, or for anyone else.
And one of the reasons that Victoria Woodhull got so attached to the free love movement is due to a very disastrous first marriage that she had. She was married by the time she was a teenager to a man who was significantly older than her. It was not a good marriage by any means. And she felt it was really unfair that men could go around and have affairs, and it was considered just, part of society, part of male culture, while women were stuck in horrible marriages and had no other choices.
Woodhull was really instrumental to the free love movement because she was, by any measure, one of the most famous women in America. Or I should say one of the most infamous, right? Thomas Nast did a famous cartoon of her called Mrs. Satan. And she had an enormous political platform. She had her own newspaper. She ran a brokerage firm. She socialized with people like Cornelius Vanderbilt. She was friends with many of the women and worked with many of the women that were in the suffrage movement at the time. So of all the people in America who might actually say these things, she got the most publicity, and I don't doubt she was a bit of a publicity hound.
So there are many reasons why she isn't remembered today. First of all, a lot of history textbooks are very male-centered with prominent white male figures from history, and a lot of women's history hasn't been included. Secondly, Victoria Woodhull was a very liberal person for her time, to put it mildly, and she was involved with the suffrage movement with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and with Susan B. Anthony. And initially they worked together, but then there came a point where her views were considered so radical by Susan B. Anthony that she was sort of kicked out of the movement. And so when the suffragists themselves, other feminists, went to write their own histories, she was excluded from that. So she was a figure who was so controversial for her time, considered so outside of the norm, that not even her contemporaries included her.
The free love movement of the 19th century was also too controversial to be successful at the time.
The free love movement had a list of demands, none of which were ever going to be put into practice by the government, right? People were not going to get rid of marriage laws. People in the 19th century were not going to get rid of laws that criminalize adultery, right? In terms of concrete accomplishments, it really did almost nothing. In terms of the larger scale, it was enormously effective in terms of getting people to think and getting people to talk about these issues.
And while the free love movement and Victoria Woodhull weren't necessarily advocating for LGBT rights, Woodhull's influence can be seen in today's movements.
I have students ask me, did she advocate for gay rights back then? I highly doubt it. She was very liberal, but, I don't think that she had reached that point. She was heterosexual herself, having been married 3 times. But certainly this concept that she and her colleague created of this free love platform is an ideology that we have seen rippling across time, across the century. And the general theme of what she was saying is still very applicable today, as far as who is anybody else to say, who is anybody else to judge my love life and who I want to spend time with.
So I'm pretty sure that nobody in the LGBT movement in the 1950s or after Stonewall said, you know what, Victoria Woodhull was really right. We should follow her example. But they certainly followed the spirit of her example, which is that the state should have no interference within your personal life.
In fact, Woodhull's ideals of personal freedom are still being fought for by activists like those at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation.
I was awestruck at this human being so many, many years ahead of her time, advocating for the things I believed in and that I wanted to lead an organization that would be focused on.
The organization focuses on issues such as protecting the rights of sex workers and protecting the rights of all kinds of families.
Victoria Woodhull was a proponent of the right to really form family. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that every individual has a right to form family. The United Nations itself has refused to define family, saying that the complexity of family today is so vast that it couldn't be limited by any one description. That's a total mirror of what Victoria Woodhull believed. If I had to explain to a student what they should learn in history that isn't actually taught in textbooks, I would say to find the hidden gems like Victoria Woodhull. We need to bring those stories to the forefront for our children and for our children's children.